Have you ever stopped to think about how a particular set of ideas, or maybe an influential institution, can just fundamentally reshape, well, everything, especially something as complex as economics? Today, we're doing exactly that. We're taking a deep dive into the really compelling story of the Chicago School of Economics. Our mission here in this deep dive is basically to unpack this stack of sources. We've got articles, research papers, our notes to get a real handle on what the Chicago School is. Its core principles, the brilliant minds behind it all, and yeah, its lasting impact and some of the pretty powerful controversies it's kicked up. Think of this as your shortcut, really, to understanding a major force in modern thought. And we found some insights that honestly might just change how you see the economic world.
That's a great way to put it. The Chicago School, yeah, it's a neoclassical school of economic thought. It's intrinsically linked to the, groundbreaking work of the faculty over at the University of Chicago. But it's crucial, I think, to grasp that it's a school of thought, a shared intellectual approach, rather than some formal organization. And we'll definitely be exploring how scholars like Milton Friedman and George Stigler became these really central figures in shaping this whole intellectual current.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then. What's the fundamental idea? What is the Chicago School of Economics at its core?
Okay. At its heart, it's a neoclassical approach to economics, deeply rooted in the University of Chicago's various departments. Yeah, primarily economics, sure, but it also really extends into the Booth School of Business, the Harris School of Public Policy, even the law school. Now, in macroeconomics specifically, the Chicago School initially really pushed back against Keynesianism. They favored monetarism. Instead, this idea that controlling the money supply is like the most important tool for managing the economy. Then around the mid-1970s, you see a shift. They move towards what's called new classical macroeconomics, which hinges really heavily on this concept of rational expectations.
Rational expectations. Okay, that sounds incredibly logical on the surface, but maybe you could give us a simple, maybe an everyday example of what that actually means.
Absolutely. Yeah, rational expectations basically means people make decisions using all the information they have available, and they act generally in their own best interest. So, if you hear that gas prices are definitely going up next week, well, a rational expectation might lead you to fill up your car today, right? It assumes people aren't just systematically fooled by, say, government policies over and over again. Now, you might have heard people talk about the freshwater-saltwater distinction. Chicago being freshwater, and then saltwater universities like Harvard or Yale on the coasts. That distinction, honestly, it's mostly outdated now. These different traditions have kind of borrowed ideas from each other. For instance, New Keynesian economics has actually brought rational expectations into its models, while still keeping its focus on things like imperfect competition and wages that don't adjust instantly sticky wages.
Okay. So it sounds like they weren't just, stuck inside traditional economic models. Then they were looking broader.
Oh, far from it. Yeah, Chicago economists left this immense intellectual mark on so many other fields. They were pioneers in public choice theory, looking at political decisions through an economic lens, and the whole field of law and economics. And this, it led to some really revolutionary changes in how political science and law are studied. I mean, their influence also stretches into areas like social economics and even economic history. Pretty diverse.
What's often striking, and you mentioned the university connection, is the University of Chicago's economics department isn't just known for this school of thought. It's an absolute, powerhouse of economic talent, consistently producing groundbreaking work, and frankly, just an incredible number of Nobel laureates.
You're absolutely right to highlight that. The numbers themselves are truly impressive. As of 2022, the University of Chicago Economics Department itself has been awarded 15 Nobel Memorial Prizes in economic sciences. That's since the prize started in 1969, more than any other single university department. And then if you count all the Nobel laureates in economics who have been affiliated with the university, as alumni, faculty, researchers, that number climbs way up to 32 out of 81 total laureates awarded. This concentration of talent has understandably been a topic of discussion, even controversy sometimes. And just recently, James A. Robinson, who's affiliated with the university, got a Nobel in 2024. And beyond the Nobels, their scholars have also picked up 6 John Bates Clark medals. That's a huge honor for economists under 40. People like Milton Friedman and Gary Becker won that too.
So how did this whole intellectual movement actually get started? And how did it, evolve over the years? Was it always this dominant force we think of now?
Not at all, actually. The term Chicago School itself, it was only coined back in the 1950s. And back then, the economists at Chicago, they used to meet really frequently. They had these intense discussions, apparently, and that fostered this kind of shared group outlook, especially based around price theory, how prices get determined by supply and demand, how they signal information. But this was during a time when Keynesianism was hugely popular, the dominant view. So the University of Chicago folks, they're actually seen as kind of heterodox, unconventional,
Yeah.
standing apart from the mainstream. And even before what we typically call the Chicago School, there was an earlier group, sometimes called the Old Chicago School, or the first generation, roughly 1920s to the 1940s. This included figures like Frank Knight, Henry Simons, Jacob Viner, Aaron Director. Now, they had diverse interests, sure, but a key focus, especially for Knight, Simons, and Director, was on the role of incentives and the sheer complexity of real-world economic events that weren't just focused on abstract models of perfect equilibrium. And interestingly, these early thinkers actually had a pretty important influence on other economic traditions too, like the Virginia School of Political Economy. So these foundational thinkers, particularly strong in price theory and also what we now call transaction cost economics, basically the costs involved in making any kind of economic exchange, they then influenced the second generation. And the leaders there were, of course, Milton Friedman and George Stigler. And following them, you get the third generation led by Gary Becker and macroeconomists like Robert Lucas Jr. and Eugene Fama. There was also this really significant branching of Chicago thought. George Stigler dubbed it Chicago political economy. It was inspired by Ronald Coase's idea that institutions sort of naturally tend to evolve towards something called Pareto efficiency.
Pareto efficiency. Okay, hang on. What does that mean in simple terms, especially when you apply it to how politics works?
Right. So Pareto efficiency basically means a situation where you absolutely cannot make anyone better off without making at least one person worse off. It's like a state of optimal allocation given the starting point. Now, when this branch applied that idea to politics, they reached this pretty controversial conclusion. They argued that political outcomes kind of inherently tend towards this efficient state already, and therefore any external policy advice, economists telling politicians what they should do, is largely irrelevant because things are supposedly already as efficient as they can be given all the competing interests and forces at play.
Wow, okay. That is a truly provocative idea. Right, let's dive deeper then. Let's unpack some of these brilliant minds who really shaped the Chicago School's legacy, who are some of the most influential figures, and maybe you can highlight some of their really groundbreaking contributions.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's start with a couple of the early giants. Frank Knight. He joined Chicago back in 1929. He's really famous for his 1921 work, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. It's where he introduced this idea of Knightian uncertainty, which is different from measurable risk, like, the odds on a coin flip. This is genuine, deep, immeasurable uncertainty, like how a brand new invention might totally reshape an industry. You just can't put odds on that. And his view was quite nuanced, actually. He thought free markets could definitely be inefficient sometimes. But crucially, he argued government programs were often even less efficient. And then there's Aaron Director. He was a professor at Chicago's law school. He's really seen as a founder of the whole law and economics field. His big insight was seeing how legal rules, property rights, contracts profoundly affect economic incentives and outcomes. Okay, moving to that crucial second generation, we absolutely have to talk about Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate 1976, hugely influential. He argued, very famously in his book, A Monetary History of the United States, co-authored with Anna Schwartz, that the Great Depression wasn't caused by some failure of capitalism itself. No, he blamed the Federal Reserve's policies. He thought they mishandled the money supply. He became this powerful advocate for laissez-faire, minimal government intervention in the economy. And he had that famous quote, "One of the great mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results." Really sums up a core Chicago idea. Friedman believed governments should aim for a kind of neutral monetary policy, focused on long-run growth achieved just by gradually expanding the money supply at a steady rate. And a really core insight for him was what he called the lag problem. He pointed out, look, there is likely to be a lag between the need for action and government recognition of the need, a further lag between recognition and the taking of action, and a still further lag between the action and its effects. So his point was government actions often come too late or have unforeseen consequences and might end up doing more harm than good. And building on this sort of deep understanding of how markets work, you have George Stigler, also a Nobel laureate, 1982. He turned his attention to how the government itself can be swayed by economic forces. He's widely known for his economic theory of regulation, which people often call regulatory capture. The core insight here, and it's pretty powerful, is that interest groups, industries, unions, whoever often use government power, like regulations and laws, to benefit themselves, not necessarily for the broad public good. This is a really key component of what's called public choice theory. And then there's Ronald Coase, Nobel laureate, 1991. His work just fundamentally reshaped how economists think about why businesses even exist and the whole idea of efficiency. In his early paper, The Nature of the Firm, he argued firms exist because of transaction costs. All the costs of negotiating, monitoring, enforcing contracts in the open market. The surprising takeaway: rational individuals will actually create corporations when the costs of just using the market become too high. It's cheaper internally sometimes. But his most famous work definitely is the problem of social cost. This is where the Coase theorem comes from. The theorem basically says, if there are no transaction costs of big if, obviously private bargaining between parties will lead to the same efficient outcome, regardless of how a court initially assigns property rights or liability. He used this vivid example from an old 1879 London legal case, Sturgis v. Bridgman. It involved a noisy confectioner making sweets and a quiet doctor next door whose consulting room was disturbed. Coase's point was, look, whether the judge initially says the sweet maker has to stop or the doctor just has to lump it, they could theoretically bargain their way to the most efficient solution. Maybe the doctor pays the sweet maker to be quiet, or vice versa if bargaining itself wasn't too costly or difficult. His broader point, though, was maybe the law should try to anticipate and assign rights in the way that leads to the most efficient outcome from the start. And importantly, the burden of proof for any positive effects should always be on a government trying to intervene.
Okay, so if that second generation really cemented Chicago's focus on microeconomics, free markets, incentives, how did the next wave, the third generation, kind of push these boundaries, maybe into entirely new areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. The third generation really did break new ground. Gary Becker, Nobel laureate, 1992, he was truly groundbreaking. What he did was apply standard economic methods, assuming rational actors, maximizing utility, to fields that were traditionally seen as totally non-economic. Things like crime, family decisions, marriage, divorce, even discrimination, slavery, drug addiction. This was a huge paradigm shift because it suggested that even these deeply personal or social issues could potentially be understood and maybe even influenced using the same kind of rational choice logic we apply to buying groceries. His work, partly inspired that popular book Freakonomics. It showed the power of this economic way of thinking in unexpected places. And then in macroeconomics, you have Robert E. Lucas Jr. He won the Nobel in 1995. His absolutely crucial argument was that macroeconomics, the study of the whole economy, needed to be built on the same solid microeconomic foundations, the same assumptions about rational individuals. And Eugene Fama, a 2013 Nobel laureate, often called the father of modern finance. He came up with the efficient market hypothesis, the EMH, which basically states that at any point in time, the actual price of security will be a good estimate of its intrinsic value. The idea is that all available information is almost instantly reflected in market prices. You can't consistently beat the market. Now, his early work showed stock prices can look pretty random in the short term, like a random walk, but he later demonstrated that any long-term predictability you might find, it's largely due to rational changing risk premia. Basically, the extra return investors rationally demand for taking on more risk at certain times. So his work overall consistently supported this efficient markets view. Another really fascinating figure is Robert Fogel. He shared a Nobel Prize in 1993. He's known for what's called New Economic History and for pioneering cliometrics, which basically means applying quantitative methods, statistical analysis, and economic theory to historical research. Using historical data on prices, wages, output to analyze past events rigorously. He had some pretty controversial works. One was Railroads and American Economic Growth, where he argued, using data, that railroads actually weren't as crucial to 19th century U.S. economic growth as everyone had assumed. And even more controversially, in his book Time on the Cross, co-authored with Stanley Engerman, he argued that based on material measures, enslaved people in the American South might have had a higher standard of living than the free industrial workers in the northern cities before the Civil War. That sparked huge debate, as you can imagine. And then just quickly, beyond the core department, you have these related scholars who were hugely influential. Friedrich Hayek, for instance, Nobel laureate, 1974. He actually taught at the University of Chicago for over a decade, from 1950 to 1962. And his book, The Road to Serfdom, which warns against government planning leading to tyranny, had a profound influence on Milton Friedman and many others. It became a sort of key text for libertarian-leaning economists.
Right. So after hearing about all these, groundbreaking ideas and really influential figures, it's absolutely clear the Chicago school has had this enormous impact. But, like any truly influential school of thought, it hasn't exactly gone unchallenged. It's had its share of sharp critics. What are some of the key critiques that have been leveled against the Chicago School and its ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. And some discomfort surfaced pretty early on, actually. Paul Douglas, who is both an economist at Chicago and later a Democratic senator, he wrote about feeling uneasy there. He said he was disconcerted to find that the economic and political conservatives had acquired almost complete dominance over my department and taught that market decisions were always right and profit values the supreme ones. Whoa. He felt the environment wasn't very open. He described colleagues who would neither use statistical data to develop economic theory nor accept critical analysis of the economic system. He basically felt dissenting views weren't really welcome. Then, much more recently, Eugene Fama's efficient market hypothesis, the EMH, faced really intense debate, especially, as you might expect, after the 2008 financial crisis. Critics basically pointed to the crisis and said, see, markets clearly aren't always efficient or rational. However, proponents of the EMH, including Fama himself, pushed back. They argued that the hypothesis is actually perfectly consistent with big, unpredictable market crashes. Their logic is sort of counterintuitive. If crashes never happened, they argue, then the average returns you get from holding risky assets, like stocks, would actually be too high to be justified. The possibility of a crash is part of what explains the normal risk premium.
That's a pretty clever counterargument, actually. What about criticisms aimed at their broader macroeconomic approach, the big picture stuff?
Yeah, the macroeconomic criticisms have been particularly pointed, especially from economists at, let's say, rival institutions. Brad DeLong over at UC Berkeley, for instance, he famously called the Chicago School's macroeconomic approach, or at least parts of it, an intellectual collapse. Pretty strong words. And Paul Krugman, Nobel laureate from Princeton, has been a very vocal critic. He describes some recent comments from Chicago economists as the product of a dark age of macroeconomics in which hard-won knowledge has been forgotten. He even said he preferred some economic models developed way back in the 1930s over some modern Chicago approaches. So, yeah, very sharp disagreement there. But of course, there's a counter-response from Chicago. John Cochran, a prominent finance economist there, he strongly dismissed these kinds of criticisms. He called them ad hominem, attacking the person or the school, not the actual argument, and said they displayed deep and highly politicized ignorance of modern economics and finance. He argued that these critics often fail to properly distinguish between genuinely irrational bubbles in asset prices and the kind of rational, time-varying risk premiums that Fama's work highlighted. Cochran also made this interesting point. He contended that if these criticisms about market irrationality were actually true, it would ironically make a stronger case against government regulation and control. Not for it, because policymakers would be just as likely to mess things up. And just to show the broader cultural impact and critique, there was that 2015 Chilean film Chicago Boys. It offered a really highly critical perspective on the free market economic reforms implemented in Chile under the Pinochet dictatorship, reforms heavily influenced by economists trained at Chicago.
Okay, so after all that, what does this really mean for us, for you listening today? We've taken this journey, haven't we, through decades of economic thought, from those early pioneers through the Nobel laureates, unpacking their big ideas, but also looking squarely at the sharp critiques they faced. It seems undeniable the Chicago School of Economics has had this profound influence, not just on economic theory itself, but really shaping public policy and even spilling over into other fields like law and political science.
Indeed. I think the core insight that really emerges, time and again, is how consistently the Chicago School emphasized markets, focused on incentives, and assumed rational behavior, and then how they pushed these concepts into areas of human life and interaction that maybe weren't previously thought of as economic at all. Understanding these foundational ideas, where they came from, what they imply, it's incredibly valuable, I think, no matter what your own economic perspectives might be.
So here's a final thought maybe for you to ponder. Given these enduring debates, and the really profound impact the Chicago School has clearly had, how might understanding its core tenets, the focus on markets, incentives, rationality, even the critiques, how might that help you better interpret today's economic headlines or the policy discussions you hear about, especially when you see different ideas clashing? Something to think about.